What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, man? How are you?
Chilling, man. As per usual. How about yourself?
I cannot complain. I've been traveling lately.
Yeah.
Not in New York. I finally left that godforsaken island, and I went from New York to Chicago, so urban city to another urban city, and then now I'm in Virginia, so I'm finally kind of far away from all the chaos. But apparently, things are better now. What's the word in New York right now? Like, how's the ground look in the heart of Brooklyn where you are?
Well, it seems like it's getting better. To be honest, I still kind of stay indoors, and I think part of the reason why is because I might have mentioned this on the last show, but I went and got my coronavirus test, as well as the antibody test, and I just recently got my results back. Apparently, I don't have coronavirus, which is great. I didn't think I did.
But I have AIDS.
But I'm going to die eventually. No, I don't have coronavirus right now, which I didn't suspect that I did, but, why not? I'm in the clinic. Let's check it out, right? And I went there initially to get the antibody test because we believed that we had it back in February because I had one of the worst flus ever. And my antibody test came up negative, which is like kind of a bummer because I was really hoping that I'd have at least a little bit of immunity so that I can, I don't know, not so I can go be reckless outside, but just so I could feel a little more secure that if I end up getting it again, my body might have a better chance fighting it off. But I guess that just means that I did a really good job at social distancing because I didn't catch anything. So if that's any indication to your question of how are things going in Brooklyn, then that's what it is. I hear that the cases are going down though. The number of new cases.
I wasn't talking about coronavirus. I was talking about the protest, dude. Coronavirus is old news.
Yeah, well, I'm still on coronavirus.
You're the only one apparently. Can you quickly send me over the YouTube link so I can tweet it out?
Yeah, of course. Give me a second.
Danny does this every single time. Forgets to send me the YouTube link.
Well, we only get the YouTube link when we start, so ain't that fast. Anyway, yeah, protest-wise, I can jump in there. Honestly, it's been quiet. I haven't seen anything crazy popping up on the Citizen app, and just the news reports that I'm reading, a lot of them have calmed down. Like they're still happening, but they're largely very peaceful. There's a lot fewer arrests that are happening, a lot, like almost no rioting and destruction. So I think that's a really positive point because now we're kind of getting to a point where we can have that national discussion about what we're going to talk about today anyway, kind of without the undertone of the violence, and I think that's probably a very positive point.
Yeah, I do appreciate I do appreciate that there's no looting anymore, which it sounds kind of funny, but I mean, the rioting only took, at least in New York, it took place in like a 3-day period.
Mm-hmm.
From the weekend to maybe Wednesday.
Yeah.
I think the day, or Wednesday or Thursday. The day that we recorded our last podcast was the last day where there was like a lot of shit going down.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, like the following day, I guess the curfew worked, right? The following day, it kind of died down, and I went to Chicago right after we recorded that show, and I was wondering, like, what am I going to see there?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing. Chicago, it was the same thing as New York. Everything was boarded up. All the major pharmacies were closed down. Like CVS was closed, which was surprising. Mm-hmm. What was open was the only thing that was open, or the only things that were open were restaurants. Surprisingly enough,
gotta keep people
things
fed,
that were
man.
supposed to be closed. But the weather was nice, so there were a lot of people outside, like eating and socializing. No mask, by the way. You wouldn't like Chicago. Not a mask-wearing culture. Like when I arrived, so I'm so used to, I was in New York for pretty much all 3 months of quarantine since March, and like a small little bubble, and I'm so used to going under like extreme precautions for coronavirus, so like wearing a mask whenever I walk outside, doing all of that. And I go to Chicago, and I go to suburbs before I go to the city to meet up with some friends, and I'm expecting to go in there with my mask and to be like someone with a haphazard suit to greet me outside and like hose me down and go into a quarantine zone before they let me in. And they're like, nope, just come inside. It's like, you don't have to wear a mask. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I don't have to wear a mask. I just got out of a plane from New York. You're not scared? You're not going to cast me in a leopard colony? But it's definitely not. I noticed there was less care, but I guess that's because we're also at the tail end. We're at the tail end of it.
It might
In
have been
Virginia
different if you
right
went
now,
in like March.
yeah, in Virginia right now, I'm down in Virginia Beach. It is no one's wearing a fucking mask. I walked into a store without wearing a mask, and I thought that they were going to shoo me away, but no one had a mask in the entire store. So all good here. But yeah, before I left, the Upper East Side of Manhattan was pretty much all boarded up. I guess they were expecting the protest or the whatever riots protest to reach there. Chicago pretty much looked the same. It was kind of weird though. The weekend before, just before I had arrived, there was a mass murder spree, not by one person, but there was about 30 murders over a weekend there in Chicago, which is a lot.
I did read about that, yeah.
Which was crazy. I don't think those murders were related to the actual protest, but it's just kind of a weird vibe there because I don't know Chicago that well. Have you ever been there?
I haven't actually. That's one of the few major cities that I haven't been to yet.
It's a weird vibe. I've been there a couple of times, and it's not that it's weird, but I'm always a little concerned about walking into the wrong neighborhood because I don't know the city that well.
I hear it's the South that you don't want to go to, but I could be wrong about that. I've never been.
It's the South, so I was like in the more northern part, a place called Ukrainian Village, and anything to the east is pretty much fine, and then if you go south, it gets worse and worse. But for those of you listening, before I left, I told Danny that I was going there for street journalism. I was like, I'm going to Chicago, and he's like, oh, why? I'm going for street journalism. And he's like, what, really? So I was like, okay, I'm gonna screw with him for a little bit. And I told him that I had an exclusive interview with some Latin kings about protecting their turf. And that I had to go through like this whole He's like, what, really? Like, you have an interview? How did you get an interview with the Latin kings? It's nuts.
I was also beckoning you to be safe too, to be fair. But yeah, you got me. Haha.
I just can't believe that you believe me.
Well, fuck you. Before we move on though, can you please tilt your camera down? You're starting to look like the neighbor from Home Improvement. What was his name? Wilson or whatever? Like all I could see is like the top of your face.
Wilson? Am I good now?
All right, you're good. Cool.
I have so many browsers up I can't see myself on camera. So I don't know. How do you want to start this? Because I guess I'll start this by addressing our last conversation. It was kind of funny because, if you listen to our last episode, Danny and I kind of had we kind of butted heads on a lot of issues. However, when we took time to like regroup and like prepare for the show, and we basically do our research separate from each other. So most of the time we have no idea what we're gonna say. Like I have no idea what Danny's gonna say. Danny really has no idea what I'm gonna say. Like we'll give each other heads up about things that we want to talk about, but Danny will never know my angle. I'll never know his angle, and we kind of came up with the exact same conclusions on something that we had not disagreed with, but we had some differences of opinion on some things, and it was just kind of funny to see that we agreed so much on this topic in terms of I guess police reform, or what you want to call defund the police.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Did you find that interesting?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, it's interesting that we could arrive at similar conclusions or solutions to a problem, even though we might be coming at it from different angles, right? So, like, you know, I might be coming from it from a more liberal perspective. You might be coming from it from a more libertarian or paleo conservative, whatever you're calling yourself these days, perspective. But ultimately, when we reviewed and shared notes before this taping here, it looked like we lined up on a ton of stuff, So that actually makes me super happy. I had some feedback recently from a listener who had told me that they had listened to our last episode, and go figure, is always going to be somebody that doesn't agree with one of us, but they didn't agree with one of us. I won't say who, and nevertheless, though, they were super appreciative that we were able to kind of still talk to each other and still openly have a conversation, even though we had dissenting opinions. Because a lot of podcasts, as this person says, just it doesn't. It's like two hosts that agree with each other. It's like a circle jerk, like a bubble, and they appreciated the fact that we were able to have a discussion with opposing viewpoints. And it's funny, just to kind of wrap that up, that when we look at the issues with the police force and the potential solutions thereof, we actually come to the same conclusion, or at least very similar conclusions. So
right. We absolutely do. You come from definitely a more left-leaning perspective. I usually come from a libertarian perspective, but we meet on a lot of things, and that's why we're able to, like, if we both were just completely like outside of each other's orbit, you know what I mean? Like if we were just completely different on every single issue, probably the show wouldn't work in the long run. If we were just butting heads on everything, like you wouldn't be able to get from one topic to another.
Yeah.
But since we kind of have, I guess, grounded philosophies, or I wouldn't say grounded philosophies, but we both have principle.
Yeah.
And we're not like partisan hacks. We both are willing to shit on both parties per se. We're able to throw like partisanship aside and meet on things that are important. But my initial kind of reaction to everything was, it was definitely a whirlwind, man. So for me, I've been glued to social media over the past like 4 or 5 days, and for the most part, I'm not really an active I'm not an active Twitter user. I'll go like a month or two without tweeting or going on Twitter at all sometimes.
Same. I don't remember the last time I tweeted.
And over the past like 5 days, I've been on Twitter nonstop. And first of all, I discovered it's not healthy for me. Like it's not healthy for me to be on Twitter all the time. Mm-hmm. It's just not productive. Mm-hmm. But I guess seeing things happen live, as far as like, seeing videos of cops beating the shit out of protesters, and then seeing videos of protesters beating the shit out of other people, then seeing footage of collateral damage, of looting. It gives you a whirlwind of emotions because things are happening so fast in the ground. You're capturing the most violent parts of the action, so it always makes you kind of like, you're just like, whoa, what, like, fuck those cops. Oh, fuck those protesters. They're not protesters, they're rioters. So it makes you kind of swing from emotion to emotion. But now that things have died down, I will say there are definitely positive things that have come. In my opinion, there's been more positive things to come out than negative things. And I'll start with the positive. Number one, quarantine is over.
Effectively, right?
Quarantine is effectively over. People are going outside. Yeah. People don't give a fuck at this point. So that's a huge plus. That's a huge win. Number two, everyone seems to be getting armed.
Everyone's buying guns?
Everyone is buying guns. So from my perspective, I think that's a good thing.
I mean, I guess it is the Second Amendment. So
more people are losing trust in policing institutions, that they are deciding to learn how to operate a firearm and learn how to defend themselves, which I think is a good thing. And third, I mean, there's actual discussion about police reform that has needed to be discussed over a really long time, because every couple, there's always murders, and they always kind of go pop up in the news cycle, and then they're kind of filtered out, by the end of the month, and they never really last that long. Like they're always in memory, but you never, the discussion kind of just dies down from there. So I think it's good that people are actually talking about police reform and what are things that you can do to make it better.
And not just talking,
Now,
but doing too. There's things that
yeah,
are being done, which is positive.
in our lifetime, I can't really speak to times from when before we were born, but I mean this has been the most impactful protest movement we've ever experienced.
I think so.
I don't know how many. There's been 100,000 people protesting. I mean, I'm just throwing a number out of my ass right now,
It
but
was a lot. Yeah.
do you think it's hundreds of thousands? Do you think it's been over a million
I think
people
it's
who've
been
joined the
millions.
protest?
I think it's been
I
millions
think,
if you want to count folks across the pond and around the
yeah, I
world.
would I would count people globally.
Then definitely millions, definitely, without a doubt.
So I mean, I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, I was kind of blown away, to be completely honest, that many people have joined this protest,
Hmm.
and I think a lot of it has to do with it is a combination of things. Like I don't want to like map out if people's intentions being bad, but I think a lot of people genuinely care about it. I think a lot of people are kind of virtue signaling and want nothing. They're trying to find stuff to do because hey, like let's go outside. There's a protest. It's a good excuse to go out and meet people. But all in all, I mean, it's 100% impactful. So I think those are the positives that came out of it. The negatives, though, because I want to bring up some of the things that I
Fair point.
find that I find disturbing about the whole movement is that so I find the weird. Well, first of all, the obvious negative is the riots. The riots are the first thing that come to mind. Private property was destroyed in the process, and it was pretty gross to see the damage and to see how much damage a lot of rioters, opportunists, whatever you want to call them. I mean, I'm still unclear about the divisions between rioters and protesters, but after looking at a lot of evidence and just looking at different sources, the vast majority to me seemed like they were peaceful protesters, especially, just being on the ground in New York before I left. Like I saw a lot of peaceful protesters. I didn't witness anyone do anything violent besides like some random things that I'm not even sure were attached to any protest. So the weird kind of like social movement that's going online is kind of weird. I'll just frankly say that. And I brought this up in the last episode, and I know this is something that we kind of butted heads on, but a lot of the kind of religious tone that has been put into the protest, such as the washing of the feet ceremonies. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I've seen a few.
So so white people these are religious ceremonies and they're Christian ceremonies. So that is something that I guess that's their way that this community kind of expresses solidarity is this kind of religious ceremony. But not just that, you see like these people who are gathered together, like just kneeling, like raising their hand into solidarity together. But I'm not making it sound as bad as off-putting as I was originally as bad as I originally felt, but kind of like these weird social kind of dogmatic groupings together. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I mean, I hear what you're talking about. I don't
It's
particularly
weird.
agree
It's
with you,
weird.
but
To me, it's weird. And then the second thing is that a lot of like the cancel culture that's going online has been ridiculous. Like for not coming out and like actively supporting Black Lives Matter or just the movement in general, or not necessarily that, just like having a diverse opinion online. There's been massive amounts of like cancellations and people who have been forced to resign from their whatever posts that they've had. So people are getting fired at work for like putting out a tweet saying they disagree with some things. So that has been pretty disturbing to me that there's been kind of like a witch hunt for people who are not direct supporters of this movement. So those are my major concerns. What do you think? Like, what's your take?
Frankly, I'm kind of surprised that the number one bad thing to come out of this wasn't for you the kind of ridiculous overuse of force against peaceful protesters. I hear where you're coming from on rioters. I'd probably put that as number two.
That's another bad thing too. Of course, like yeah, obviously the overuse of force. But to me, like I don't want to say this is a good thing, but at the very least, it kind of like adds to the narrative that there needs to be reform.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I mean,
obviously,
that's kind of the irony in it all.
When a cop bashes a peaceful, because a lot of the stuff I've seen, man, it's been a case of like. There's been a lot of conflicts where you couldn't really tell what happened. There's been some clashes where clearly the cops were in the wrong, like just bashing a protester with their shield for no reason. Like I've seen a lot of those videos of cops like cracking down with peaceful protesters. But I've also seen a lot of videos of protesters absolutely antagonizing cops and encircling them. And I don't blame the cop for reacting the way they did. Like, I've seen a lot of those types of videos. So I think it goes both ways. Again, most of the evidence I saw online seemed that the protests were generally, at least they turned pretty peaceful. But, I think it goes both ways. But ultimately, it's the responsibility of the cop to show restraint and not use like maximum excessive force on someone who's protesting.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the worst thing for me.
The car thing, like everyone saw the video of the NYPD officers who ran over those cops.
Ran over the protesters.
Like ran over those protesters. That is like a kind of a crazy situation. Obviously, the cop shouldn't be running over protesters, but if you're banging on a hood of a car, of a vehicle, things are going to go wrong. Like you have to know that as an adult, that you can't put yourself in that position of messing with an automobile. So I think the blame goes both ways on that. But
well, I mean, then I hear what you're saying, but humor me this: Tiananmen Square, we saw a lot of people protesting in China against the government, and there's the one iconic photo and video of the one man standing in front of the tank, and I actually don't remember what happened to him. Fairly certain he died. But the point of blockading this police car wasn't, hey, we're dumb and we're just going to stand in front of a car and we're stupid to put ourselves in that position. The whole reason for it is to say, together we are strong. And together we can even stop this police car from proceeding to wherever they are. Because they were angry with the police, because they were angry at the system. And you see that they utilized a metal barricade, and they put it between them and the cop car. Obviously, it's not going to protect them, but it's a measure that they utilized. And then there's a bunch of people throwing trash and shit. And I said this before on the last show, I get where the cop is coming from. In the cop's mindset, the cop isn't thinking, I need to show restraint. The cop is thinking, I just saw a bunch of videos of people burning, police cars, and I don't want to be in this car when I get burned. But if you just look at the video, he's wide open behind him. He totally had the option and the ability to retreat and pull back, and he chose instead to push forward. And that, I think, is where I cannot stand behind the decision that police officer made. And to some other,
I don't think it was a decision. I think it most likely came out of panic.
Yeah, well, like you said, police should be held to a high standard of restraint.
I agree with that. But situations like that, like people just panic. You know what I mean? When people are like, they don't know someone's going to try to grab you out of the car.
So he had a
Like,
fight.
so
he had a fight or flight response, right? He had a fight or flight response. And he had the option to flee, and that was to reverse. If you see the video, he had the option, right? And I think, that's just one isolated incident, too. I mean, I've seen several videos of folks just standing around doing their chanting. And by the way, I do want to address the kneeling and the hands up. They're not religious. They have purpose. So kneeling has been, a cornerstone of Black Lives Matter for some time. I mean, Colin Kaepernick is probably most famous for it, right? So that's the kneeling component. And putting their hands up in solidarity with one another is a chant that came around the Black Lives Matter protest, which is hands up, don't shoot, which is trying to show the police that they are neither armed nor do they pose a threat, but they're nevertheless protesting. And so by putting their hands up and saying don't shoot, they're trying to highlight the fact that they have the right to do this, right? Their First Amendment right to free speech and assembly. And nevertheless, they've got their hands up and they're kneeling, and folks are throwing flashbangs and tear gas and rubber bullets and shit. And it's just kind of ridiculous. And, we see you're right. There is a irony in all of this, and it does propel the narrative. And I think that's why we've had so many, I think, fruitful and productive conversations and even some decisions made to reform the police, because here's a protest about police and police brutality and use of force, and here is an example of the police doing exactly that against this protest, which is just, I watched John Oliver last week. I took a quote from him because I thought it was great. He said, "If you're asking why a spontaneous decentralized protest can control some of its participants more than you are asking the same of a taxpayer-funded, heavily regimented workforce, then you can go fuck yourself." So the idea that, because a small fraction of protesters were violent and rioting and looting, and that's where a lot of people put their, focus, and not put the focus on the idea that a heavily regimented, taxpayer-funded group of, officers are not showing the proper restraint and are not showing, frankly, respect, is crazy. It sets up a false equivalence.
Hey, listen, I understand the point that you're making. I'm just saying that there is when you go to a protest and you start throwing stuff at cops, and when you start doing like crazy antics, you're an adult. You have to expect a backlash. Like, you have to expect the cops to respond to that. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that has to be among your expectations of what's going to happen if you provoke a cop. Now, I'm trying to make the point as well that most of the crackdowns I've seen were completely unjustified, but I saw plenty that were at the same time. Like, I saw some things that, frankly, like, what do you expect to happen if you're banging on the hood of a cop car when it's moving? What do you expect to happen if you're encircling a cop and you're screaming God knows what at them? Like, they're going to react to it. Like, they're human beings. So that's the point I'm trying to make. It's a case-by-case basis, because all these protesters are different. Like, they're different people. There's different situations. There seems like there was probably 1 million protesters worldwide. So the vast majority of what went on seemed pretty peaceful, and there actually was no conflict between the police and protesters. But those cases, I think you got to call out the ones that were the people who did things to escalate the situation. Now, what I'm more concerned about is that, and this always happens, honestly, this is kind of a characteristic of a lot of left-wing movements, the focus on canceling and tearing down things. Like, we were talking about Confederate statues last week, and, whatever side you come upon, I think a lot of people will find it a little bit more controversial, or a little bit more across the normal line, to start removing statues of Winston Churchill.
I mean, I think where I stand on this. I personally think that statues. I
mean, not destroying statues of. I know you personally think that.
Yeah,
like, statues are dumb.
And that's I think these statues are dumb. I think it's like narcissistic idolatry, right? Like, we're glorifying war is what we do with these statues, and I find it very difficult to sympathize with the statue and the proponents of the statue because of that. But
But
I
like
hear
the
both sides.
disrespect and how the statues are being completely defaced and like, come on. I think Churchill was an imperialist and he was a war criminal in many regards. He totally screwed up the Gallipoli campaign.
Right.
He made a lot of mistakes. I mean, that's not like my main criticism of him. And he was also a pretty racist guy if you read his writings. But I mean, Winston Churchill is part of British history. Like, how do you tear down a statue of Winston Churchill? To me, that's just the act of erasing one's own history. Like, it's almost like you hate the culture that you come from, and it was just shocking to me. It was shocking to me that that these protesters, these furious protesters, started aiming at statues of such an icon in the UK.
I mean, that's
it's not just that.
That's one way to look at it, Henry. That it's erasing culture.
Like, remove our history.
But like,
I mean,
think of it this way: if like history and the preservation of history is relegated to how many statues we have, then we're doing a really bad job at history and teaching and maintaining history. Just because we tear down a statue doesn't remove.
But it's rampant protesters that are doing it. It's not like a local government voted on it. It's not like the local government. All right, if you're a local government and you want to, and the people are voting to remove a Confederate statue, that's one thing. If you are a rapid, vengeful, mean-spirited, vicious person who wants to deface public property that other people enjoy, then you're a piece of shit. Like, there's no, like, if you're throwing things on statues that other people visit and other people like to look at, and you're just defacing public property, public or private property, you're a piece of shit. Like, I have no patience for people who destroy shit like that. Like,
I mean, as you said, Winston Churchill was a big racist.
All right, that doesn't justify just destroying just icons. Like, we can destroy every single statue in the United States,
and I think
or
I'd
Britain.
be okay with that.
Like, you want to go on a rampage where we just start shoving statues? You know, somebody in Virginia the other day, I think it was yesterday, pulled down a Confederate statue, and the statue fell on them, and now they're in critical condition.
They're dumbass. Like,
I mean, I feel bad for the person, because from what I've heard, like, the person's actually seriously hurt.
Well,
but
they pulled it down, as you pointed out.
They pulled the statue on it. Like, if you want to remove the statue, there has been statues that have been removed. You can go through it in a legal process and vote for it and go lobby to your local governments and say, hey, like, the statue we find off-putting. We want to put this past us. If you want to go through that route, then fine. Like, I have really no issue with that. I have more of an issue with defacing things and destroying things.
You're taking issue not necessarily, well, maybe a little bit, but not necessarily with the history, but more with the crime of defacement.
With both though, like, I think it's important to preserve history because you learn from that, man.
Yeah, I agree.
I can't tell you.
Totally
I can't
agree.
tell you. I learn stuff all the time from statues or like little like
placards,
historic placards and things like that. Like, I was in Maine last year, and I spent like a half hour reading this placard about estuaries in Maine. I was like, whoa, this is awesome. There was a Civil War battle here too. Like, I was just like, and I looked it up, and I thought, like, this is really interesting, and I never learned this or never knew that any of this happened in Maine. So I like, people do learn things from statues, and it's just barbaric to start just tearing down your society. Like, I mean, it's just, I have no excuse for that.
Yeah, I think there's like areas for compromise here, right? And I think that while I agree with you that the crime of defacement and like destroying public property, that shouldn't go unpunished, or
any property,
or any property for that matter, right?
So anything that someone put blood, sweat, and tears, and someone purchased, and someone sculpted, like, someone put a lot of effort into building that statue.
Yeah,
that statue probably means a lot to some people who visit it.
Right.
Like you're just going to destroy it like you're some animal, like you're some Visigoth who's conquering Rome. Like,
Yeah, I
come
mean,
on.
yeah, I'm with you on
What are
that.
you, a Mongolian?
I'm with you on that, man. I think, though, however, on the opposite side, there are appropriate channels that you can go through, and as you pointed out, there are cities that are, that went through legal channels to remove Confederate statues because of um, the symbolic pain that it causes, a good amount of people that outweigh from the perspective of the voting bloc that allowed for the removal of the statue. It outweighs the benefits of the history that you can learn. Now, I think, personally speaking, I've not visited a Confederate statue, and I don't know what's on that placard. You know, right now, from my perspective, all I see is a statue as an example of the leader of the Confederate Army, and for a lot of people, regardless of how well respected General Robert E. Lee was, I think for a lot of people the symbolism of the leader of a movement that sought to keep and own slaves is unacceptable. And so if you were to keep such statues, I think we'd have to take a Twitter approach to this, and we'd have to place, I think, some fair context around the statue. And I think it would be fine for there to be a bipartisan, historical lesson to say these were the accomplishments that this man had. However, this is the movement that he was the leader of, right? And this is the historical context by which the statue was erected, so that we can have a public debate and a public history lesson around it. But unfortunately, what I see in that statue is just a statue glorifying a man who, led a rebellion against the United States. So I think personally that the statue should be removed and placed into either private property where there is no legal jurisdiction around it, or in public museums where the context is set appropriately, right? And we can still learn from it, and we can still appreciate the art of it, right? Nobody is upset. Like, if you're Jewish and you go to a museum and you see Nazi paraphernalia, you're not upset at Nazi paraphernalia being displayed in a museum, I think, generally speaking, because you understand the context. The context is that we are in a history museum, and I am learning about the history, and therefore this is being displayed. But if we put up Nazi flags in the streets without the historical context, I think it's right to assume that people should be offended by that. And I think the lack of that context, is what the real issue for me is. There is a serious lack of context around those statues, and if we're going to keep them up, we need to either create that context or we need to remove them, because I think they're offensive to a lot of people.
Well, a lot of those statues do have context about who they were and what they did, and I'll just tell you this. So you're from the Northeast. Have you ever lived in the South?
No.
So I mean, I lived in the South, and Southerners look at the Civil War very differently.
I understand. I'm dating a Southerner.
than Northerners. They have a very different perspective. Not all of them, but a lot of them do.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, a lot of their perspective in a lot of ways adds a lot more context to the conflict. I know we're supposed to have a Civil War debate eventually, and I think we'll be able to cover a lot of ground, but they don't look as a statue of Robert E. Lee as a symbol of like white supremacy. They look at it as a symbol of like Southern pride, and like a symbol of like a lot of the carnage that happened during the Civil War, because the Civil War was fought in the South. Like, there was hundreds and thousands of people who were slaughtered. So I think they carry it around as part of their history about the struggles they went through, more so than like, yeah, this was a time when we used to own slaves and own land. It was more so like, this is the leader who protected this city, who kept Richmond from being burnt from the ground from General Sherman. Like, this is like, that's the context of what they look at it. Like, it's a completely different context, and the way the Civil War is taught in school is, I don't want to say, all right, I want to say this until we actually debate this, but it's
they call it the War of Northern Aggression. I get it.
It's the lens, or the War of Southern Independence.
Mm-hmm,
There's either or. They don't consider it a civil war because they consider themselves a sovereign nation, but they look at it as a sense of like of Southern pride more than like in any type of. Most Southerners don't have like a white like a white identity attachment to those Confederate flags. You do have groups like the KKK, which most Southerners absolutely despise, who take those symbols and they use them and it poisons them. So there is that. I mean, a symbol like the swastika is something that's obviously so poisoned that you can't use it in no matter whatever context. You know what I mean? Like you can never have that, because
despite the fact that it has like
it's just like
thousands of years of history
like you're just immediately your reaction. Everyone's reaction initially when they see a swastika is to be repulsed.
Right.
It's kind of it's that poisonous. Down south, like that doesn't have the same type of repulsion. Like, do people feel that repulsed by the Confederate flag? I mean, that would be kind of that would be, I guess, surprising to me, since the Confederate flag has been part of American culture up until like the past like 2 decades. Like there were shows. There was a show called The Dukes of Hazzard where their car was called the General Lee, had a huge Confederate flag on it. Like that show wasn't about racism. It was about a bunch of Southern boys who were fucking around.
Of the South.
Yeah, it was just about a bunch of Southern boys fucking around. Like there wasn't any kind of racial attachment to that. And also, like, there were army brigades. You know, there were platoons that would rock the Confederate flags. And there's a really good picture if you type in Confederate flag in Lebanon when Eisenhower sent peacekeeping troops in Lebanon. There was a group with a Confederate flag. So it's like been a lot of Southerners joined the army, and they rocked the battle flag is what we are referring to.
The Virginian battle flag, yeah.
They used it as a sense of like who they are. But
I mean, I find that ironic in general. But let's, like you said, I think let's put a pin in it and kind of pivot back. Let's put a pin on this. But there's other things that are going on as far as like people getting canceled. There's a bunch of statues. The 54th Regiment of the Civil War, the all-black regiment of the Civil War was defaced. I don't know if you heard about that. No, I didn't.
In Boston, Massachusetts, the 54th Regiment, which was all black Union troops, was graffitied.
Well, that just doesn't make a ton of sense.
I don't think the protesters knew what it was, most likely, or it was like you wouldn't fought for the man type of thing. I'm not sure what that was. I think in England they took down a Lincoln statue. There was a bunch of statues, man. There's too many to really count. I think Christopher Columbus, did they get that one yet, or are they just trying to petition that?
That was
in Minnesota they got.
That's a long time coming, man. Don't get me started on Chris Columbus.
Don't get me started on Christopher Columbus. And then you also see the New York Times opinion editor being forced to resign because he released that op-ed from Tom Cotton, which was, by all accounts, pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. If you saw that op-ed from Tom Cotton.
I only saw the highlights of it, but yeah, it was pretty nuts.
It was a pretty ridiculous op-ed, and Tom Cotton is a pretty ridiculous man. He's a neocon that kind of attached himself to Trump's nationalist movement, which I don't like, and I would never ever support him if he ran for president. However, you're seeing like the guy from news, like editors being forced to resign. You're seeing people who have nothing to do with politics being forced to quit. Like I guess one of the founders of CrossFit was forced to resign from his position because he tweeted something inappropriate. There was a soccer player that was fired from the LA Galaxy because his wife said something on Twitter. He didn't even do it. So like that is like the type of kind of culture stuff that I really don't like when this mob mentality happens and they start trying to remove people and censor people and cancel people and get them fired from their jobs.
I think there's a level of like there's
it's quite scary when you do that because you can take stuff that we say out of context and you can use that against us. Like,
sure.
I really just hate that environment.
Sure. No, and I see where you're coming from on that. I don't honestly feel strongly for or against it because I see examples that I feel are totally ridiculous, as you point out, where people are either canceled or forced to resign or something like that for something that is clearly benign or taken out of context. But I see an equal number of things that are just absolutely ridiculous and, I deserve some accountability. And I don't know. I'm on the fence about it. I don't feel strongly either way.
What?
I mean, look, it's
Like,
hard.
what deserves to be fired? Why? If you make a stance on this, if you have an unpopular opinion, like, why would you deserve to be fired from your job?
Well, I mean, you got to remember that many employment in the United States is at will, and if you do, and as a representative, especially high level representatives of a company, what you say and do has an impact on the company that you work for, especially at the highest levels. And if you are saying something that goes against what the company wants, I think it's they have no right to censor you, but they also don't. They're not compelled by law to keep you either.
See, this is where I get worried about just a limit and suppression of speech. I understand what you're saying, that they're not liable to keep you if you say something, utterly offensive that will bring bad press to, whatever their organization. But I mean, Jesus, that seeps down to just the average everyday worker. Like, what if you have an enemy on Twitter that you're arguing with, and you're like, fuck this guy. I'm gonna find out who he is. I'm gonna find out where he works, and I'm gonna get him fired. Like that. That's happening.
Depends. What did the guy say? What did the guy do? If the
But
guy.
that's just such a fucked up thing. Like, why would you do that? Like, that's a completely unacceptable and terrible thing to do to somebody. Like, you're gonna have an argument with somebody, or you're gonna disagree with somebody's take on Twitter, and you're gonna try to get them fired. Like, why would you? Why on earth would you do that? Like, what's wrong with you?
Well, like here's a good example. So I don't know if you saw this one, but there was a woman in Central Park, and she was walking her dog without a leash.
I saw that. I saw the video.
The bird watching guy
acted like a nuts. She was a Karen.
She was a racist Karen on top of being a Karen. And like, if I was their employer, I wouldn't want her to work there either. Like, cool, you have the right to have whatever opinions you want, but I also don't. I have the right to not want to employ you anymore, because I don't want that to be a part of my culture. And the idea behind that Karen act that she did was that, like, what if she applies that type of logic in the workplace? If she's flagrantly exhibiting it while being recorded, like she knew she was being recorded, then what other flagrantly racist things or even just ridiculous Karen shit is she doing? And she got canceled for it. And I'm not upset about it.
I mean, honestly, that woman made a huge mistake, but I don't think someone's life should be destroyed over that. I have a little bit more sympathy towards people who may have a moment of weakness and may do something bad. I think it was totally gross. However, I'm not going to endorse her getting fired from her employer. Like, that would be mean and nasty.
Well, I mean,
have a lot of mean and nasty people on the internet who try to do, and they get them mobs, and they try to get people fired.
It's not our
going
position,
on right now.
Though. It's not our position, though.
It's like a witch hunt. It's like the
to
Crucible.
endorse. It's not our position to endorse or not endorse whether or not that person should be fired. But it's totally fair to point out, that ridiculous, racist, and stupid thing that she did, right? And if the employer decides, based on the evidence, that they no longer want to employ her, that's their prerogative. But I think to say that we shouldn't be allowed to call out injustice when it's there, and therefore if someone does an injustice, that they shouldn't be held accountable for it, I think, people should take a different stance on that. Like, people should think twice about being a fucktard, being a Karen.
People should police the way they talk and they think, because they're always being recorded by Big Brother, and they always should be worried about their livelihood. Like what she did looked pretty shitty. Like
It was pretty
she
shitty.
didn't
It
look
wasn't looks.
she looked like a pretty shitty person based off that. But I would never try to like hold that over. No matter what anyone did to me, I would never try to hold their livelihood over them and try to get them fired from their job. Like that is just a gross thing to do. And you see a lot of like that kind of justification when going after people on Twitter, just trying to get canceled, removed from their media platforms. Like I just hate that culture.
Well,
It's so
let me ask
suppressive.
you this. Let me ask you this. Let's say Bro History blows up, and we become this giant media company, and we employ people, right? Wouldn't you want to know that one of our employees is out there doing some fucked up racist shit? Wouldn't you want to know that
Well, what's the
information?
definition? What's that definition of racist? Like,
Let's say
I'm not gonna pay that.
let's
I'm
use
not
the
gonna pay
exact
like.
let's use this exact example. We employed Karen, that Karen from Central Park. We're her employers. How would you feel first of all if you found out that Karen did that?
Well, first of all, we would have a media company, so we would be publicly. The context is a little bit different since we would be a media company and we're in the public eye, or we would be more in the public eye than we are
So
right now.
maybe we branch off, and with
But
our LLC we make
I
a
don't know.
different
It would
company.
depend. It would depend. It would depend on that person's overall behavior. Like if there were signs of that I noticed that I didn't really like in my culture, then yeah, I would make moves. But I would take it on a case by case basis.
Right.
But I'm not trying to use that extreme example. Like that is the I guess the extreme example where you caught someone acting like a damn fool. I'm talking about other examples of like someone saying like I've known of people who are Trump supporters who've had their livelihood taken away from them just because they were hardcore Trump supporters. I know people who have just said like minor critical things about like social justice type issues that had Twitter mobs dox them and post their address out live. Like it's just like a really gross mob mentality, and it comes. I don't want to say it comes packaged with left wing movements, but it's something that that is more common on left wing movements than right wing movements, and I'm very very turned off by that Salem witch trial approach that seems to accompany these movements about you need to think this way or you are a racist. Like you see those celebrities released a video about like people are like making these solidarity videos to denounce their white privilege. Like Aaron Paul, the guy from Breaking Bad, and that was the only person I recognized because I don't really know celebrities that well. However, it's just kind of it's like this religious cult movement that goes on, and those are the things that really turn me off from these mass movements, like this ideological fervor that accompanies them.
Well, listen, I mean, what you're describing, I think the anecdotal evidence of like a Trump supporter whose livelihood, was ruined because he's a Trump supporter. These are anecdotes, right? And I disbelieve that the majority of the cancel culture is benign activity. I think that the majority of the cancel culture are legitimate issues that people bring up, and there's repercussions to those legitimate issues. I mean, I don't think that there are stats on this yet, but I disagree with the idea that the overwhelming majority of this cancel culture is just going after people with like Orwellian wrong thought. I think it's legitimately a lot of people who hold disgusting viewpoints or do disgusting things. And now that we live in an internet age where literally there's cameras pointing everywhere, and the rate of us disseminating information, namely video or audio, is such that we can instantly call people out on their bullshit, and if there's a repercussion for that, that's kind of on you. I don't think that I don't think that either of us can prove or disprove our points here on what the proportion of bullshit versus legitimate shit is in this cancel culture. But I think it warrants a fair bit of research. And on that point, I think I'd concede to just disagree.
All right. Well, Live PD is no longer on air. I hope you're happy.
Well,
Um,
I
they
mean,
canceled Cops and then Live PD.
look,
Something. So
cops and live PD legitimately like promote the idea of black criminality. Like
that's what
that's
I was watching Live PD. They show a lot of white trash
of
too. They
course they
keep it
do.
pretty.
Of
They
course
keep
they
it.
do.
It's like every other like shot is from a black guy to like poor white trash.
Hmm.
And they I was watching this with my friend who's like a Republican, and I'm just like watching this show in amazement. Like this show, I'm like thinking in my head, like, how do these shows are terrible. Like the fact that these shows kind of capitalize on people's lives being ruined and the enforcement of just brutal tactics. Like I was just like, how has this thing been on for so long? Like I'm just thinking this in my head. And my friend who's like a very staunch Republican, he's just like, these guys are going to hell. Like he's watching like the end because Live PD they do it like the Red Zone NFL.
Yeah, and they do
Where
like
they
live
have
commentary. They're switching
yeah they have
cameras. Like
commentary, and my friend is like, these guys are going to hell. Like I was like, oh my god. So it shows you like there is not all Republicans are just pure cop worshippers. They can see through a moral. They have some moral ground on issues of authority.
for sure.
But let's segue into the actual topic.
Yeah,
'Cause
we've been going on
we're
for an
bullshitting-
hour now,
we're
and we haven't
bullshitting-
talked much about cops.
We're bullshitting way too much, and we've been on for an hour. Fuck.
Yeah.
All right. So defund the police. Like, so there's this movement called defund the police, which is like kind of vague, and that's like kind of one of my issues with the movement as well, is that a lot of the demands, at least the way they're portrayed by the media, or at least the way that they are delivered on social media, sound very vague and they sound very, very extreme. So defund the police is pretty much the main motto right now. Defund the police.
Yeah, I did a lot of research on this.
For
Actually,
for normal people, you hear the word defund the police, the first thing that you're going to do is be like, what the fuck? Like, defund the police? I don't want to live in anarchy. Like, I don't want to live in that type of environment. And you see footage of the mayor of Minnesota. I'm not the mayor of Minnesota. The mayor of Minneapolis engaged with these protesters, and he's trying to. I guess he's taking their demands, or he's trying to. It looked like a hostage situation, and. Their protesters are saying, do you support the abolishment of the police? And he's like, I do not support the full abolishment of the police. And you see him get booed. That's what is going on, the news cycle for right-wing media, by the way. Like, that's being played over and over and over again.
I've seen it. I
And
switch
it's
the
like,
channels every now and again.
this is the narrative right now, that leftist anarchists are taking over our major cities.
For sure.
Move away by gun. So they don't do. That's obviously. It's awesome to watch because it's like one of the most amazing pieces of footage ever. However, that's going to scare a lot of normies away from that idea. And I think the issue is that defund the police is incredibly vague. Like I said earlier. So you jump in right here. Tell what is your perception of defund the police? What does it mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually
how
think...
radical is it on a scale of 1 to 10? Like, are they talking about like living in Mad Max 1 or Road Warrior?
I think the problem with so there's actually 3 big ones on the table that I want to discuss at length: defund the police, disband the police, and privatize the police. Those are the 3 big ones that are coming around, where that third one is really coming out of like libertarian think tanks, who might agree with the issues, that are pervasive in the police department, and their solution to it would be the privatization. So I want to talk about all 3. But before I do, I want to start by saying that I actually don't think that it's as vague or as scary as people make it out to be. And I think the media does a terrible job at this, at explaining these things. And furthermore, I think a lot of people, even within the protest movements, but even people who are on the opposite side of it, they just aren't well enough informed and kind of jump on the bandwagon, right? They're angry with police brutality and they hear defund the police or, disband the police, and they're just like, yeah, do that, without really understanding what does it mean, right? And there's actually a whole lot of study on it. I read a really good article by Christy Lopez from the Washington Post. It was an op-ed, but I think she does the best job of all of the research that I've done on this and breaking it down. And, really to talk about the three options for the solutions, you kind of have to recognize why are we even talking about this? Like why do we even come to the idea of defunding, disbanding, or privatizing police in the first place? And I think there are so many pervasive issues, and we definitely don't have enough time, but a couple of big ones are we ask police to do way too much stuff, right? Police are like the Swiss Army knives of the public sector. I mean, we ask them to do accident reports, respond to, people who have overdosed, arrest people, boot homeless people from local, public places, resolve verbal disputes between family members, a number of crazy broad things. I have good friends who are police, and I hear about the crazy shit that they ask them to do, and it's a little weird, why are we asking people, a police officer to, attend to someone who is overdosing on a drug? They're not qualified for that, right? But in many communities, they're the only public first responders that can get after it. And so part of this issue is that we're over relying on the police, and our expectations of the police are so high, and the police are people, and many of them make mistakes, and also some police are fucking assholes, legitimately. Not all, some. And then we come to this issue, so defunding the police in this case doesn't mean just dropping all of the budget for a police department and no more police. What it means is shrinking the scope that police have for their responsibilities, and shifting that monetary funding to other entities that would be better equipped to deal with a lot of the shit that we ask police officers to do. So what does that mean? It means that rather than having a police officer respond to someone who is overdosing on heroin, as an example, we invest more in EMTs who are much better equipped and much better trained to deal with that situation. Rather than having a cop run after, chase fucking dogs in the street. I was watching a former Dallas police chief. This is one of the silly examples of things that they have cops do that he pointed out, was that they have cops just chasing stray dogs. Why are we asking the cops to chase stray dogs?
What is this? The Russian Winter Olympics?
What is...
Remember that story?
No.
How during the Winter Olympics in Russia, there was a big stray dog problem, so they just euthanized them all.
Jesus, no, I didn't hear that story. That's crazy. But it sounds
the U.S.
on
would
brand.
do the same thing. The U.S. would do the same thing. We euthanize dogs every second,
yeah.
But it was just kind of everyone was horrified. Putin's euthanizing the poor puppies.
Yeah, fuck him. Anyway, so kind of back to what I'm saying. Defunding doesn't mean no more police. Defunding means reducing the scope of what police do. And I'd add to this. This is something that the author of this op-ed didn't address. I'd add to this decriminalizing drugs and taking the giant budgets, the giant portions of police budgets that are dedicated to drug law enforcement, and moving that into the health sector, because we should be treating drugs, and we'll get into the drug war and shit like that in a bit. But I think we should be treating that as a health issue, because health experts are better suited to treat this issue than police are. 100%. And when we do that, and when we narrow the scope of the police to be there to truly protect and serve us, then a lot of the pervasive issues with policing, at least proponents of defunding the police believe, would kind of resolve themselves. right? So rather than getting after the stray dogs, they could be, walking down the street and being an active member of the community and forming those bonds. Rather than, trying to resuscitate someone who is overdosing on heroin, they could be, preventing a robbery or a murder, right? And potentially we would need fewer police because of this, because their scope would be narrower, and therefore we wouldn't need as many of them as we have. Does this make more sense about what defund police means?
So yeah, it's vague and it sounds like abolish the police, and it seems like I think the thing that people need to understand is that this protest movement, I think it goes way beyond the scope of just Black Lives Matter at this point. Like, they're the face of it, but there's a lot of different groups that seem to be in coalition for this, this one movement, united under the banner of Black Lives Matter. It's hard to nail down what their exact demands are. They do have a website that you could actually just look up everything.
Right.
And abolish the police or defund the police is one of them. I should actually have their website up right now, but I don't. But I did go to their website. A lot of it's hard to nail down because it's not monolithic. There's different members, there's different chapters who are calling for different things.
Right.
But I think, yeah, there are some people who probably have the more radical, ironically enough, libertarian position of abolish the police.
Or privatization of the police.
Or the privatization of the police.
I definitely want to talk about that.
Yeah, I don't think they're necessarily thinking about the privatization. I don't think they're not referring to Murray Rothbard right now.
I want to refer to Murray Rothbard, to be honest.
They're not referring to Rothbard. They're not ANCAPs who've been thinking about the total privatization of the state. They're thinking just like get the police out and let us do our own thing. And then there's some people who have a much more rational, or I don't want to say rational, but they have a much more moderate position on it.
Moderate's a fair word to use. Yeah.
They're not saying defund the police. They're saying let's
do police reform.
Let's do police. Yeah, essentially they're asking for police reform, and they want to stop these huge budgets. So those are the voices that I think that people should be paying more attention to. What's interesting though is, and I was thinking about this, I think the more radical voices actually do serve a purpose because they toe the line. They toe the line so far. Yeah. And obviously, this is what the NRA does. This is what any group that's advocating something is going to toe the line as much as possible. So they don't have to. They can gain as much ground as possible, knowing that
shoot
they're
for the stars. You hit the moon.
Yeah. So, they mostly seem to be advocating, diverting funds into more social programs and to end certain militarization.
Yeah, that is defunding the police, though.
Yeah.
That is what that idea is. Now, you might get a bunch of people, both, people who disagree with defund the police because they don't understand it, and also people who agree with defund the police and don't understand it. But that, I think, was the best kind of explanation. It's not getting rid of the police. It's reducing the scope of the police and what they're tasked to do, and diverting that monies to other sectors of the government that are better equipped to handle those things. And I think that's one. But then there's abolish the police, right? So, and this one sounds probably the scariest to a lot of people. Because unlike privatize the police, abolish the police doesn't, the wording, the language, abolish the police doesn't give you okay, well, what's the end result if you abolish the police? We're just going to live in a lawless land? What's the deal? So I see the aversion to it. But according to, the author of this article that I was reading, what it means is it's quote, it means recognizing that criminalizing addiction and poverty, making 10 million arrests per year, and mass incarceration have not provided the public safety we want and never will. The abolition language is important because it reminds us that policing has been the primary vehicle for using violence to perpetrate the unjustified white control over the bodies and the lives of black people that have been with us since slavery. The aspect of policing must literally be abolished. So, in this case, we are talking about not a moderate idea, right? In this case, we're literally saying we should not have police because police have not been effective at their job, period. And the reason why they use abolish is because there is that kind of racially charged issue of, police brutality, specifically against the black community, and abolishing slavery is the very specific coded language that they've decided to utilize for this idea. But I think what's important to think about on this is that even among the people who want to abolish the police, they admit that this isn't something that you just kind of snap your fingers and then suddenly there's no police. I don't think I've read any rational idea for abolish the police that has argued that immediately today, we should stop the police, just no police. I think everyone understands that it would be a phased approach, and I think the overlap between defund and abolish is that we should be diverting that funding towards other governmental sectors that are better equipped to handle certain things. But ultimately, no one thinks it's going to happen overnight, and I think a lot of the media, specifically right-wing media, when they cover abolish the police, they present it in a light that is scarier than the actual intentions behind it, the actual ideas that the people who came up with these ideas had in mind. When I see Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity saying, "What do you mean get rid of all the police? What are you, fucking crazy?" Yeah, it is a crazy idea to get rid of the police just immediately, but that's not what they're planning to do.
What's interesting though is that it's Sean Hannity. He came out and he was really coming down on the police brutality.
Yeah, I was actually very surprised with that.
I was actually surprised because Sean Hannity is typically he's not. I'm not. You or I are. Neither of us are fans of Sean Hannity, and I was surprised that he came out and didn't try to kind of tote the normal kind of right wing line on everything. Mm-hmm. But it was or very mainstream right wing line, I should rather say. I should make that separation.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I was actually surprised to see him do that. Rush Limbaugh also reached out to the Breakfast Club. The Breakfast Club with Charlemagne the guy.
Yeah. What did he say?
And he was saying how terrible he thought that the killing of George Floyd was. He said it was a disgrace.
Wow.
So I think the fact that this is something that everyone recognizes is good. Obviously, the call between Rush Limbaugh and I watched it and honestly, it was incredibly cringy to me. Both from everyone, everyone sounded very cringy on it. You guys can listen to it for yourself and make your opinion, but it shows you that there is dialogue between both the right and I don't want to say the left in that terms. It's more of the right and black communities. So that's interesting. Something that I saw on Tucker Carlson, and out of everyone on Fox, pretty much Tucker Carlson is my favorite guy who's on mainstream news. I agree with a lot of the stuff. I disagree with a lot of the stuff that he says, but I think that he has balls and he says, he doesn't tote a line. He says what he thinks on, at least now he does. But I think he was dead wrong on one of his segments he had the other day. He had Keith Ellison. He was showing clips from Keith Ellison, mm-hmm. and Keith Ellison had a clip about how something that we need to change is that cops need to stop bringing guns to situations that do not require guns.
Yeah,
they need to stop they need to stop bringing guns to things like you mentioned earlier, mm-hmm. Overdoses or routine traffic stop, or just like random shit that they shouldn't, that don't require an
Traffic stop
escalation.
might actually be a bad
And I
example.
and I felt and I and I
But yeah,
found that yeah, traffic stops is a place where a lot of people get murked.
yeah,
Um,
where a lot of cops specifically get murked. Actually,
the cops get killed there
hmm
too, so that's definitely not a good example.
hmm
It's just a dangerous zone.
right.
Traffic stops are dangerous.
But like simple
Um,
shit, like honestly,
yeah,
chasing dogs and
simple shit.
stuff. Yeah, welfare
Simple,
checks, as
simple,
Chris points out.
yeah, simple shit. And I was like, yeah, I mean that's completely reasonable. And Tucker Carlson was like, you see what the Democrats want to do? They want to strip us from our protection, you know. So I did not agree with that.
Hmm.
But what I those points are all interesting points. But you and I think if you listen to our last show, you know, we had some differences on like I don't want to say the semantics of white privilege and if cops are are intentionally targeting black people or not, but whatever statistics that you look at,
Hmm.
you know, I think that the most damaging thing to pretty much everyone who's criminalized by cops, like if I was going to do one reform, I would start with the drug war.
Hell
I
yeah,
would
hell yeah,
start right there because I think that is the reason why
100%. Yeah.
uh, you know, if you look at stats, so there was this article from Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute on the Wall Street Journal, and um, it came out right after George Floyd died, or beginning of June. And Heather McDonald, I need to watch what I say because I belong to the Manhattan Institute, um, is a cop sycophant. She's very pro cop, and she's kind of like she's incredibly abrasive, um, very abrasive woman. And this book, I mean, this you know, she pointed out in this Wall Street Journal article that you know only nine got it was out of all the deaths last year, all the so in 2019 police officers they fatally shot 1,004 people. 235 of these people were black.
Hmm.
And in 2018, the latest year for which the data had been published, blacks made up 53% of the known homicide offenders, and they committed 60% of robberies despite being 13% of the population.
Hmm. Hmm.
And she also pointed out that the police fatally shot 9 unarmed blacks and 19 unarmed whites in 2019. So those 9 unarmed black victims represent 0.1% of all blacks killed in 2019. So those are the big statistics that she pointed out, and really she contributes the fact that because if you look at the numbers, it shows that a higher percentage of black people are victims of per capita are victims of police violence, but overall, white people are just because they're the majority of the population, but per capita, it's black people or and you know the reason why I think that is mainly because of the war on drugs.
Right, and
Because
so
the war on drugs,
to clean up what you're saying, it's basically, and I looked into this too. You know, it's a very uncomfortable statistic that, you know, while black people and just minorities in general are disproportionately killed per capita, like the rate, um, they are in fact killed at a higher rate than whites. They also happen to be disproportionately higher perpetrators of crimes, including homicides and others. And that's kind of an uncomfortable statistic to wrestle with. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, when you think about this problem, you have to really keep asking the question why. You know, why is it that black people or minorities um, are statistically more likely to perpetrate those crimes? And you either come to one of two endpoints. The one endpoint is that they are somehow more criminal. And I think not only is that a weak argument is racist, and also it doesn't exactly prove itself, right? It's just a soft kind of Occam's razor to that argument. I think probably a stronger argument to make And the
It's
drug war would be one, would be that there are external factors at play that cause, or at least create the circumstances by which minorities and just poor people in general, frankly, white or black or any other race, it creates the conditions by which people are more likely to commit crimes.
and there's one point I want to add to that. Another reason why it's so stupid is because it's such a small percentage of people who are actually doing crimes in the first place.
Right.
Like we're talking about a very the people. If you want to break out one demographic of people who are committing crimes, it's best not to do it by race. You do it by age, because it's usually young men between the ages of like 17 to 30 years old. I'm not sure what the exact age demographic is, but it's young men who are committing crimes across every single race.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people who are committing crimes. There's such a small. It's for the most part, most people don't do armed robberies or
Yeah.
don't commit
Overwhelmingly.
rape or
Yeah.
overwhelmingly. So we're talking about such a small percentage of the population that is actually engaging in this type of criminal activity. So I think that's important to point out. And another thing is that you need to look at the policy is way more like, when there's something. I think the major thing that we were debating last time we spoke was. We were trying to figure out like what are the policies that are causing
Creating the conditions by which.
creating conditions for discrimination and racial profiling.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think the major thing is the war on drugs.
I
And
agree.
over the past 5 decades, the war on drugs has cost us $1 trillion. When you make something illegal, it does not remove the demand. Instead, it just creates a black market, and that demand never goes away. And you need to look at historical examples. Like the most violent time in U.S. history in terms of policing was the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't now. It wasn't like modern times. It was in the 1930s when alcohol was illegal. They're in
Correct.
the peak of
The
prohibition.
Capone days, you know?
The Al Capone days, and I think it was around 300 policemen were murdered that year. It's a really high number compared to what we're seeing now, and they created this system where black markets emerged, and that operation, these operations that were controlled by either gangs or organized crime, were dependent upon police arresting people for alcohol, for distributing alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the police are the ones who are creating these black markets that these gang lords are using force to protect.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear because, I read this one thing on Time that basically was talking about the idea of, how the drug war fuels the saturation of police in low-income communities of color to get after the drugs that they've themselves made illegal. And because of the illegality of those drugs, like the drugs don't go away, as you point out. They just end up on the black market. And the criminalization of that creates black markets and creates gangs that protect those black markets because there's a financial monetary incentive behind the sale of such illicit drugs. And then you turn around and you say, okay, well, this is a problem. We're going to put more police there. Right? We're going to police this thing that we've ourselves made illegal, understanding that there definitely will be a black market for this. Like you said, the 30s were way worse, right? And we've learned nothing from the prohibition of alcohol and just decided to criminalize the shit out of everything, honestly. But definitely marijuana seems like the most ridiculous thing to criminalize. And as a result, people don't stop smoking marijuana. Like people don't stop buying marijuana. And what's interesting about that is that, if we look at the statistics on it, if you break it down by race, there almost isn't a difference between the ratio of people who use, illicit drugs. Like, it's almost the same for every race, black, white, Hispanic, or the other. And nevertheless, because of too many factors to describe, like generational wealth disparity, as you pointed out to me in a conversation once, the lack of a history of land ownership post-Civil War among black communities. Black people tend, statistically, to be more impoverished than white people, and therefore live in impoverished areas, which therefore get heavier police presence, which therefore cause additional conflicts and additional arrests. And, I think you're absolutely right. Like, if we had not criminalized, let's just take marijuana as an example, then a ridiculous amount of incarceration in this country would just never have happened, right? We would have created way less negative interactions between, frankly, not just black people and the police, but all people and the police.
And it takes low-level users, and it takes them in and out of the court systems.
Correct.
Like, you're going to take a drug user, and you're going to throw them in jail. Like, what do you expect to happen? It's going to create a violent criminal out of them.
Right.
If you throw a drug dealer, like, I think there's something that's still. I don't condone drug use, but I don't think that if you are addicted to drugs that you should feel inferior or be looked down upon. I think that you should just get help, and people just need to be accepting that you need help, because it's a serious problem. I think the last thing that you need is to be thrown in jail if you're being arrested for just being a drug dealer, or excuse me, a drug addict or a drug dealer. But if you're just a drug user, and that's the way that you turn someone into a menace to society. There's this movie that came out. It's kind of a corny movie, but it's called Shot Caller.
I don't think I've seen that one, no.
It's with the guy who played Jaime Lannister in Game of Thrones.
Really?
And he
Nikolai Coster-Waldau?
Yeah. He plays a guy who gets into a DUI, and he kills his friend in the back seat. So he's arrested for manslaughter, and he goes to jail for it's supposed to be like a 2-year sentence, and then he becomes like a badass leader of like the Aryan race gang in prison. God. And he's like an accountant or something, and it has like a finance job prior, and is living like a completely normal life. But how do you expect to get back into the normal world after serving a sentence of however many years incarcerated, where you need to, you'll be a victim if you don't adopt if you don't adopt a more kind of I don't want to say primitive. I'm not the best with words tonight. More alpha, more testosterone loaded behavior, however you want to say it.
If you don't assert yourself and stab
if
the
you don't
biggest guy
assert
in the
yourself,
room.
if you don't assert yourself the correct way. So there was a study that Jordan Peterson, I remember, he brought up about taking troubled kids and mixing them with the kids who were not troubled, like school children, and they found out that the study was hoping to prove that the troubled kids would have the kids who came from more privileged families, who were not having trouble in school, who were generally good students, would rub off on the students that were delinquents, and the opposite effect happened. Like, and then the social scientists were their conclusion was wrong. It's kind of like that. It's obviously you're going to adopt to those circumstances, But I don't think there's really no point of adding, any more uh, to pontificate on that point anymore, because there are more things that you can reform as well, like ending qualified immunity, which is a very clear demand that I've seen from protesters, is
For sure.
to end qualified immunity. And for those who don't know what that means, it's just a legal doctrine that shields government officials from being sued for actions performed on their job. So what it does essentially, it requires a victim to it requires a victim of police brutality to identify an earlier decision by the Supreme Court or a federal appeals court, and it has to be in the same jurisdiction of that the same conduct had been committed. So you need a precedent.
Let me jump in here because I think I can clear this up a bit more. Let's say you are the victim of police brutality. Let's say a police officer just randomly decided to, I don't know, hit you in the head with their baton for no good reason, right? And you want to sue that police officer, right? Well, the police officer could say, I have qualified immunity. I was acting under accordance to the law because I'm a cop, right? And it's within my jurisdiction to use force, and therefore I am immune to your lawsuit. The only way that you can get around that is if you're able to prove that there was a previous Supreme Court case in your jurisdiction where another cop hit another person with their baton in the exact same way. And what's really crazy about this is that I'm not kidding about exact same way. Again, I was watching John Oliver over the weekend, and he made this one example. There was this one issue where someone had released a police dog onto an unarmed and cooperative person, right? In a ditch in the forest, right? And they tried to sue the police officer for doing so, and they found a case that was upheld by the Supreme Court where a police officer released a canine. I'm gonna butcher this, but they released a canine against a cooperative person in a ravine in someplace else. So the difference there. By the way, they lost the case, right? Because it wasn't the exact same situation. It was slightly different, and therefore they couldn't argue against the qualified immunity, and that police officer was able to, not be sued because of their qualified immunity. So the point, though, is that even very small differences in the ruling by a Supreme Court judge, very mundane differences, could make you lose a case to supersede qualified immunity. So it's a pretty bulletproof shield. Cop can do whatever the hell they want, and unless you can prove that they did exactly something that the Supreme Court said was, against the law, they're good. They're fine. And that's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. And there's another thing. There's no liability for cops either.
Yep.
And just going back to that, we made the joke that it actually wasn't really a joke. It was more of an observation. If George Floyd died, and that wasn't filmed, that could have very well been declared. It probably would have been declared a COVID-19 death.
Very likely. I mean, he actually did have traces of COVID-19.
He had COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been classified as a COVID-19 death. If it was in New York City, it would have been. But yeah, there's really no liability for cops either. And I think something that you would do is that you could make cops get liability insurance. So if a cop gets sued, first of all, the taxpayer doesn't have to foot the bill. And pretty much every profession on the planet where they have the ability to cause someone damage, they have to get personal liability insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So why can't cops carry personal liability insurance just like doctors do?
I mean, they should at a bare minimum, for the reason that you pointed out, that it's the taxpayers who end up, paying for the misdeeds or the actions of the police officer.
Well, what the other thing is that an insurance company is not going to give somebody insurance who has a criminal record,
Mm-hmm.
or like Daniel Schaefer. That guy shouldn't have been a cop,
Right.
and I believe he had a lot of complaints. Like what's the number of complaints? I forget the exact number.
Too many. Too many.
There were red flags about this guy being like very unqualified and not having the temperament to be in law enforcement. Someone like that with that many complaints wouldn't get insured. I'm sure a lot of cops wouldn't be insured
Mm-hmm.
if they had to get insurance, like a doctor. If they had to show their insurance rates went up, or if the insurance company refused to insure them anymore, if they had a really bad record. So I think adding that to having cops like doctors get liability insurance could provide more accountability.
For sure, and I think to add to just the liability, we also have an issue of police records themselves. And right now, it's not a public record. When a police officer is like written up or does an infraction or is put on, certain penalties are applied to them, a lot of that information is not public. It's private, and it stays within the police force. And I think, with the idea of an insurance company not wanting to insure or charging higher premiums for higher risk police officers, right? We should also have the accountability on the basis of the public, the taxpayers, the ones that are effectively paying their payroll, vis-a-vis their taxes. They should be able to see their record.
No, absolutely, and it should be visible. And I just think if it came out of their own bill, like if they were personally responsible for their actions, and we didn't have to pay as taxpayers, because right now, you ever see that video of there's that case of the guy being shot to death with a pellet gun. Did I talk about this last episode?
No.
About the guy, there's this exterminator.
Oh yeah, he was
in
like shooing
Arizona.
away some pests with the pellet gun, right?
He was showing a pellet gun to a friend or something like that, but someone called the police on him, thinking that he had a firearm, and he clearly didn't. He was crying on the floor, literally crying, begging for his life. This cop was just barking orders at him. He's like, "Sit down. You crawl over to me. You crawl over. Put your hand," like just saying things that were contradicting each other, like crawl over and keep your hands up. And his shorts, he's wearing basketball shorts. His shorts fall down as he's crawling over to the cop. Cop loads about 9 bullets in him, man. It was a disgrace. Like, he just shot him dead. He executed him. And this guy was suspended, and then he came back, and then he retired with his pension.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's so much, unaccountability in terms of that. That you can do something vicious.
Yeah.
And you can just completely just have that swept under the rug.
You know why this is,
and retire
right?
with your pension.
You know why this is, and this is almost weird to come out of my mouth, because typically I'm in favor of these things, but in this case, I think it's the extreme example of why it doesn't work. It's police unions. Police unions are the reason why a cop like that, who could in cold blood murder the shit out of someone, and then be suspended and then come back and be able to retire and still get paid. The reason why is unions. Unions are, the point of a union is to fight and advocate for workers. But in this case, police unions take this to a fucking extreme, right? So there's this article from the Washington Post that I read that points out that the nation's largest police departments have fired at least 1,881 officers. Shit, I actually forgot to write what time period. I don't recall when it was. I'm going to say it was last year. Don't quote me on that. So let's call it last year. They fired 1,881 officers last year because of infractions, the things that they did that was fucked up, right? Good reasons to fire them. And they were forced to reinstate more than 450 of those officers after appeals that were required by the union contracts. So that's like a quarter of them. A quarter of those people who committed a crime or did something to warrant their firing, and because of the appeals process and because of the strength, frankly, of the union, they were reinstated. I mean, fucking talk about like a Marxist wet dream, you know? Like the police unions know how to union, such that it's so extremely good that they're able to get criminals their jobs back.
This is how we turn the left wing against unions.
I mean,
this is the plan.
But they're kind of the problem, you know. And I was also reading this other thing about how
you should see you should hear about teachers unions.
I mean, teachers unions are like toothless when you compare them to policing unions.
Dude, if you're a teacher, you can get away with fucking anything if you're in a teachers union, and if you have tenure, you can get away with a lot of misconduct.
I mean, police and being in a police union, you can literally get away with murder, not figuratively.
I know,
like literally get away with murder.
You can get away with molesting a kid, like not anything short of like molesting a kid in a teachers union. But yeah, murders obviously, these are horrible crimes. But yeah, obviously that's the murder thing is the one that's being taken advantage of. So something I saw this article pop up in Tennessee. So the Tennessee House, they passed a bill that would give criminal penalties for issuing police ticket quotas.
Oh yeah, I'm so in favor of that.
And I really liked
the
sound of that. So I think a huge issue is just straight up piracy. Just acting like fucking pirates.
It's extortion for sure.
Just pirates. So we've all been. So I make the drive from New York to Virginia a lot, and I drive through
US 1
Route 13.
Oh, you do 13?
I do Route 13, and I'll go through New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia.
You don't do 95 at all?
It's my roots are down in Virginia Beach area, so that's a whole different direction. But it's about 3 hours south of DC, of the DC area, where most people will use I-95 to get to.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take that drive, once you get to Delaware, you'll notice that there's the speed limit goes from 55 to 35 suddenly. Mm-hmm. And this happens consistently. So this happens pretty much, I would say, 6 to 8 times. There's a speed trap like that. It goes from 55 to 35. And it's just like you go 55, 35. And I've been ticketed many times on this trip. Everyone gets ticketed. Everyone who makes this trip consistently is caught in one of these speed traps. And it's fucking piracy. Like, it's just straight up, they're road pirates who are extorting people. Now, something in terms of like racial profiling, I mean, I've been looking through evidence over the past week. I think I've seen enough studies to convince me that that black people are pulled over more by police than white people, by a lot. Just because I've seen the studies how they show data versus versus daytime traffic violations and nighttime traffic violations, where it would be harder to see the color of their skin.
Right.
So I think that a lot of cops intentionally target people who are vulnerable, who would be less likely to bring these or fight the charges or fight these like kind of minor traffic offenses.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're the people who are affected are young people, minorities, and mentally ill, but mainly poor people from these kind of minor traffic violations and things like that. And of course, these traffic violations cause violence. I mean, we said it earlier before that this is when a lot of shit goes down. A lot of shit goes down.
Exactly. A routine traffic stop is the most dangerous statistically action that a police officer can take, and nevertheless, it's routine.
You'd want to make. I mean, that would be in the interest for the police, for the police safety, for safety to avoid those situations, because you never know who you're going to run into. Like, you could run into somebody who is mentally unstable, who has a gun, and who can kill you, and who maybe this is the last time they want to get pulled over and just snaps. Like, there's no reason to have speed traps like that. Like, there's no reason to be pulling over people for like missing headlights.
And the reason why they're doing is they're trying to generate more revenue for their for the city.
For things like suspended licenses as well. Like, I think it's just these minor offenses are so stupid, man. Like, the only thing that I'm not a complete libertarian. Like, this is where I lose a lot of my libertarian street credit, because I'm not for, at least I haven't got there yet. You know, I've become way more libertarian over the past 2 years. So I definitely haven't got to the point where I'm like an ANCAP or a Rothbardian. I do like Rothbard a lot, but I wouldn't call myself a Rothbardian.
I want to spend some time after your spiel here, because I would like to talk about the privatization of police specifically, but
yeah,
continue.
but I want to talk about that as well. But it's I'm actually forgetting the point that I was going to make.
Sorry.
So.
You're not quite there yet, is what you're saying, right?
I'm not quite there yet. So I lose my street credit right there. I was going to say, you know, one of the main things I think that police are useful in are preventing DUIs, because I've just known people who've died in drunk driving accidents, and I think it's just super sad to see young people get killed in DUIs. But so I'm not like a total like let's completely defund the police, but yeah, I think this is a good segue into privatization. Like, what is privatizing the police? It sounds fucking nuts to most people. Most people who aren't like either looking at like libertarian theory or, you know, looking at Rothbard. Like, if you told me about privatizing the police like 5 years ago, I would have been like, what the fuck? So what do you mean? Like, just have a bunch of like mall cops everywhere? Like, I think either having a bunch of mall cops everywhere or having warlords are the things that people that comes to people's mind. But what is your take on it? Because I know that you have a lot to say.
Oh man, I'm ready to shit on Murray Rothbard. So,
well, be careful, because like we have a lot of ANCAPs and libertarians listening.
You can feel free to disagree with me.
They will dismember you. Just go on.
I just think, look, especially on, I can have libertarian like viewpoints from time to time. Like, I come to those conclusions as well. But specifically on this one, I think that the arguments that Rothbard lays out are very not well thought out. Let's just put it that way. I think he dogmatically clings on to the idea that the capitalist system, that the free market will solve all problems, and doesn't consider existing realities on the ground with our capitalist system today and how a free market a free market privatized police force could actually be perverted by the worst parts of our existing free market society, right? So he brings up some good points, specifically about the incentives of police and the incentives of business owners and of landowners and of homeowners, the incentives that they have to provide really good service. He brings up some good points there, but he just fails to, like, time and time again, to really think through what does this mean for people on the ground. And I will make a very strong argument against it for specifically underprivileged people. So lower middle class, poor people in general will really, really get fucked for the privatization of the police. So I just want to start here. So he says,
and just to add some context, so I don't think most libertarians, when they say to end the state, essentially, and live in a stateless society,
mm-hmm.
I don't think the transition, maybe some, I can't speak for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the transition starts with disbanding the police. So this theory would work in an already stateless society where mm-hmm. everything is privatized and there mm-hmm. is no public land. Everything is private ownership.
Yep.
Because the main thing to take in mind when looking at Rothbard is that the state is a monopoly on violence. They are the biggest. They're the ones who are doing the most violence on people. The act of taxing people is an act of violence because it's stealing from people. Like, the main crux is that is to abide by the non-aggression principle, and everything that a state does to keep its existence afloat violates the non-aggression principle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd like to make the argument here. I understand the context under which, because he actually starts off by saying, like, imagine a fully privatized world where, land ownership is, all lands are private, right? So we're already there, right? So I agree. We wouldn't just start by privatizing the police. We would start by, privatizing land ownership and getting rid of the state in that respect. So I get it. I still want to make the argument, though, especially when we talk about the principle of non-aggression, that there is no checks on aggression from the free market against, and I will be very specific on this, poor people. There is no checks. I think it actually enables aggression to people without means. So let's take a look at this, right? So he starts off by saying, and I'll quote him, "The fact that all streets and land areas would be private would by itself solve many of the seemingly insoluble problems of private operation. What we need to do is reorient our thinking to consider a world in which all land areas are privately owned." So as I pointed out, he sets the framework here and says we have to be, we're starting from a totally private landscape, and now we're talking about why we need to privatize the police. He starts off with this utterly ridiculous premise, thought example, if you will. So he says, consider the Times Square area of New York City, a notoriously crime-ridden area where there is little police protection furnished by the city authorities.
This was written years ago.
This was written in 2016, and I will point.
Murray Rothbard has been dead.
This was
for years, dude. This has not been written in 2016. This is taken from a book.
All right, man. I'll give you that.
Murray Rothbard has been dead for fucking over a decade,
dude.
I'll
give you that.
Come on.
I'll give you that. I was wrong. But here is here's the point.
Institute, they take selections from his writings.
I'll give you that. I'll give you that. I was wrong. I admit it freely. I'll give you it. But when you think about this real fast, he was writing this from the perspective of Times Square being a notoriously crime-ridden area, right? Which in the past it was. But we're here in 2020, or rather in 2016 when the Mises Institute decided to publish this, And he's writing that New Yorkers are in a virtual state of anarchy because police protection is inadequate. State-run police protection is inadequate. But we still have state-run police protection in 2020. And as a matter of fact, violent crimes have gone down quite a bit, specifically in that precinct. Times Square is actually one of the safest places in New York City. And, in the 2019 article that I read, it said that last year there were 2,600 major crimes reported in the Midtown South precinct, which includes Times Square, according to the police. So that's a drastic drop from 1990. So I don't actually know when he actually wrote this because I was wrong about it in the first place. So do you know when he actually wrote this book? What time frame?
For a New Liberty.
When was this?
And I'll look it up.
I'm gonna guess.
It could be probably the 70s.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna guess.
I think 1973.
73? Okay, fair enough. So what it's saying is that was a drastic drop from 1990, where 23,000 major crimes were recorded in that area. You can even bump that up a whole lot more to say that in the 70s it was even worse, right? Which I think we can agree upon that.
Yeah, New York in the 70s was very dangerous.
Right.
It was not. So, it's not.
Extremely dangerous. State-run police department. In 1970, in 1990.
Incredible amounts of corruption.
Right, terrible amounts of corruption.
Just
and
terrible.
We're still under a state-run police force, and that crime has gone down considerably.
Well, you'd have to look at so our police have grown since then. There are more police officers. Because now on Times Square, pretty much every single block you see a cop.
Yeah, dude. There's a mini police station. There's those fucking machine gun cops all over the place.
It's crazy to think that New York was that dangerous back in the day.
Right.
Because now New York is really not dangerous.
No.
At most places, like in some time you could be pickpocketed maybe, but like,
I mean, history was not kind to his hypothesis that he evidently wrote in the 70s. Because history shows that from 1970 to today, we remain having state-run police departments, and nevertheless, crime has gone down.
Well, have we increased the amount of police since then?
I would say so.
I think so. I'm pretty sure. So. I'm pretty sure we have in New York City, at least the way the police. Because when Giuliani became mayor, he was known for cleaning up the streets, the broken window policy. If one window breaks, it attracts the wrong type of people, type of thing going on. Right. But there's definitely more policing going on in Manhattan, and objectively, that area in Times Square it's much safer than it was in the 1970s.
Right, but it's still public. It's 100% not private. And so his premise was that. And I'll continue because he makes a good point on this one. He says that, imagine a situation where everything is private and, all of the merchants in the Times Square area became known as the Times Square Merchants Association, right? So they became like a collective, if you will. And then he writes, the merchants would know full well, of course, that crime was rampant in their area. If crime was rampant in their areas, if muggings and holdups abounded, that their customers would fade away and would patronize competing areas and neighborhoods. Hence, it would be to the economic interest of the Merchants Association to supply efficient and plentiful police protection so that customers would be attracted to, rather than repelled from, their neighborhood. I actually have no problem with this assertion. I actually think he's right. He's spot on. Where I think he's wrong, or at least where I think he's narrow-scoped, is that it's not necessarily that it has to be private. It's that it just required more policing, right? Because we've increased pretty substantially the police presence in Times Square, and if we're looking at from 70s to today, it's fucking night and day, like quite literally. So like he's not making a strong argument that specifically privatized police forces would do the trick. It's just more police did the trick.
Well, I think he's making the argument that police would have more of an incentive to protect people. So maybe you could make the case that you wouldn't need as many cops because it's like a fucking police state in Times Square. There's literally cops everywhere.
Yeah, armed to the teeth.
Armed to the teeth, and a lot of that is post 9/11 stuff.
Right.
I can't believe I had to think about if there were more cops. Yeah, of course there's more cops in the 1970s. Obviously there's a lot of to do with like counterterrorism, 9/11 stuff. But could you get that job done more effectively with a privatized police force?
That's the question.
And could you prevent less cases of police brutality in those cases as well? Because the security, the police force that works for a collection of of Macy's and other retailers in that association, they will fire a police force that is brutal or has a history or has bad publicity. So they have an incentive to not only protect the streets from violent criminals, but also not engage in things like racial profiling, brutality, harassment, and things like that. So I think...
So he makes a point on this, actually, and I'll quote him. So he says that the Merchants Association, furthermore, would be induced by their drive for profits and for avoiding losses to supply not only sufficient police protection, but also courteous and pleasant protection, right? And I think it's a little vague what he means by courteous and pleasant protection, but I think we could agree that, brutally assaulting peaceful people, is probably not courteous or pleasant, But, I mean, give me a break. Even the most...
Tear gassing people is not courteous or pleasant.
I know, dude. It's but even the most professional, best possible private security forces aren't known for courtesy or pleasantness. Right? It's not a part of their ethos, right? It's not a part of the whole culture around policing in general, right? Because there's nothing pleasant.
You're not trained in Israel to be courteous and pleasant.
Exactly. There's nothing pleasant or courteous about using force against a criminal, unfortunately, So this idea, this premise that you can somehow find these magical police officers in the private sector that are going to be super nice to everyone and also keep you safe and also do all these things, and that somehow only private sector ones can get this done and not public ones. I don't see that as a strong argument yet. I mean, he goes on and makes some more arguments, but so far, not seeing a really strong argument for it.
We want to live in a world where, like the Andy Griffith Show, we have the small-time sheriff who knows everyone in town, who has a great relationship, who has this kind of dumb sidekick buddy, Barney. Right. I think that's kind of what we want, the Andy Griffith Show type cop. But I think police can definitely be pleasant sometimes. Even police right now, I see plenty of cases. We're kind of spent the last 2 episodes tackling police brutality, but I see police do really nice, generous things all the time too.
I agree.
I don't want to not.
I agree.
I don't want to not I don't want to omit that that information.
Of course.
Here's an anecdotal example. So there is a homeless lady who lives on my street or in my vicinity, and there's a cop. He's a black cop. He comes and he gives her pizza all the time. He gets her a slice of pizza all the time.
That's super nice.
And it's just really, really nice. I'm just that's a really generous thing to do.
Right.
So I see those interactions. I've dealt with really good, cool cops in my life. I've dealt with some dick cops too, but I've dealt with good cops.
I fully
I've
support
seen
that.
there's there's what the NYPD needs. You remember that photo that was front page of the New York Post of that cop giving his shoes to a homeless man? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
you're
I think
absolutely
I
right,
think
dude.
that was
There's
definitely an act of kindness on the cops' part. Like
Mhm.
it definitely seemed like it was a genuine act of kindness. But the NYPD spun that like this
Yeah,
is
they're
perfect
like,
for
oh, look at
us.
this, look, we're awesome. Yeah, no, but dude, I mean, again, these are examples of public sector police, right? Publicly funded, state-run or city-run police being courteous and pleasant, right? This
I think that comes to their person. I think that just comes to their personalities.
exactly right. So this isn't some magic wand that you can wave of like free market that suddenly makes people more nice and courteous.
But you'd be fired if you treated people with disrespect. Like if you were like, I'm not going to that store because that cop's an asshole or that cop's a. All right. Here's an example. I historically do not get along with bouncers very well, and I have they're basically the police for that bar that you go
hmm
into.
hmm
And I've had situations with bouncers where it's like it can't even work me going into the bar, you know? Um, so it's,
So that bar loses money, loses your patronship, right?
yeah,
You lose
because
your
that,
patronage
because
because the bouncer's a
the
dick.
bounce,
I get it.
because the bouncer's a
I get
dick.
it, and I understand Rothbard's idea that there is no incentive for the police to be courteous or nice or give you good customer service because they don't give a shit about the business, right? All they give a shit about is enforcing the law or abusing the law in some certain cases, right? And I get that. I totally understand it, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's not the privatization that makes people more courteous or pleasant. It's literally the practices of hiring and training that does that. Because it's totally possible for you to hire a bunch of shitty private cops, and yes, you'd probably fire them, but again, you'd have to, like, you would go through this process in the same way that the regular police do.
I think they're looking. I think Rothbard is looking at the lens of like, all right, so if you go to the customer service value of it,
Mm-hmm.
so they're obligated to provide some sort of customer service to their clients' customers.
Mm-hmm.
So they have a very clear incentive to be polite and to patrons. On the other hand, police can be dicks, and yeah, it comes to their training, but you can train somebody as much as possible, and you can maybe make them the most badass cop ever, or you can give them some trainings that they sleep through about being courteous and polite to your fellow citizen.
Right.
But if they're an asshole, and they have unchecked power, then I mean, good luck. I mean, that guy has a badge, that guy has a gun, and he basically has the authority to make you dance like a chicken. So it's not there. There's no accountability. I mean, now we are seeing the demand for accountability, but previously we weren't. Like
Right.
cops could treat you like shit and get away with it, and
I
it
hear
has
that.
to do with working for the state. Like it has to do with working for the man. Like I have unchecked power. I have the power to throw you in a cage. I have the power to charge you.
I hear that, man. We spent like 2 hours talking about like the fucked up things that are involved in the police system that we should reform. I hear you. But let's talk a little bit about accountability then, or more specifically, the ability to provide the ability to provide a privatized police force which would garner exactly the result that you're looking for, right? Because if you're saying that in the private sector there's a incentive, to provide high quality service, well, high quality service comes at a price, and I think to the point that I made in the beginning of this, I don't think Rothbard is considering the an equal distribution, if you will, of like high quality services, because not everybody's going to be able to afford this, right? It's only going to be the people who can afford high quality police departments that can actually get it, and for those who can't, well, you're kind of fucked, So, I think that this is really only effective for businesses or for communities that have the means to pay for high quality police protection, right? Businesses with very slim margins. I'm talking about your mom and pop shops. You know, they're not, especially like right now dealing with COVID. Can you imagine, right? Like they're not going to have the capacity to provide the same like private police services as some mega corporation. They're just going to be able to get whatever it is that they can get. And you know, Rothbard and you are right in saying that a high quality, courteous, and pleasant police force would attract business, and not having one would effectively repel business. But in his libertarian private society, only the business with the best capacity to pay for good and private police forces are going to survive. Right?
Well, if there is if there is an ample supply of police services, then the cost will become cheaper for the business or either you or the home association, because I would imagine it would be through like a home association. If you wanted to get police for a retail, like, you know, you join a home association and you all vote on what police force or what security force that you want to hire to for security measures. I would imagine that there would be a lot of competition within the market, and it would be something that would be very high demand. So I think there could be affordable solutions, like, you know, there's affordable solutions to pretty much a lot of things that we once delved or thought would be incredibly expensive. I mean, look at your phones. Like, you know, our phones used to, and this is not a perfect example because I'm talking about like an electronic product and then policing services, but just, you know, let me just make this example real quick. A shitty phone used to be over $1,000. It used to be like $5,000. The phone that you would see in the 80s, you know, like that big brick phone.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
They used to be an incredibly expensive luxury item, and over time, as producers started to make phones more expensive, make more phones, the prices came down for the consumer. I mean, I think that the service, I think that there could be a market solution.
Okay, I hear where you're getting at here.
For lower income.
I disagree.
Housing projects or businesses maybe in areas that are not as affluent or not as wealthy. I think there could be.
I disagree, and I know that you said not to shit on you for your poor example, but I kind of have to, right? Because I think it highlights my point.
I used a terrible example.
So
I knew I was making it as I knew I was making the bad example as I was saying it. And I was like, that's not the best example.
Well, I mean, like with the phone example, I'm gonna call you out on it, and I'm not gonna be mean about it, but I do want to call it out because, you know, I think a lot of people, specifically libertarians, have this idea, you know, that, you know, with an increase of supply, you know, will kind of smooth out the demand portion of it and cause for better pricing and more competitive pricing. But in the specific example, the giant phone, right? You know, we're talking about manufacturing processes that got better, that made it easier to produce these phones, and, you know, networks getting better, which made it more accessible for a lot more people. So economies of scale kick in, and we have a way better phone by every standard at a much more affordable price, right? And so that's how that works with these consumer goods. But we're not talking about consumer goods. We're talking about a finite service provided by human capital, right? You cannot economy of scale human labor unless you're willing to pay them like fucking dirt poor wages. In which case, that violates the principle that you want the highest quality service. Right? Human resource, capital, human capital is a finite resource. Right? So it doesn't matter if there are, you know, thousands and thousands of different private police organizations, right? They still all need to pay each of their police officers, their private police officers, a living wage. And that wage is not going to go away. And if they do not competitively pay them, then they'll work for another company which does. And if that company that does pay well right? They're going to have to charge more for the service of policing, otherwise they're not going to make a profit. Right? It's not a system unless we're straight up going like full Zoltan, Istvar, and saying that robots are going to take over policing, which is a possibility, frankly. Unless we remove the human capital component of it, you're gonna hit a wall. The wall is either going to be you can't pay these cops cheap enough and get high enough quality service, or you can't make the service cheap enough and get high quality service. Like, you're gonna run against that wall every single time. And so with this in mind, I come back to the issue of poorer communities, poorer businesses with slimmer margins. For these people to survive, they're going to have to charge more for their goods and services. And I believe that price, way more than perceived safety, has a lot more to do with consumership, right? If I found out that a particular product or service that I really want is much, much cheaper at one store that's maybe a bit more unsafe than another store, you bet my ass I'm going to the unsafe store because I want to save money, right? I'll take that risk. So this puts like businesses, small businesses, at a particular disadvantage against, say, a corporation who can easily undercut their prices, right? They have enough money and enough capital to be able to afford the highest quality police services and not price gouge or nominally increase the prices of their goods and services. Mom and pop shop can't compete with that. And a very similar argument can be made for residential areas, right? A gated community with, let's say, I don't know, an average household income of $200K plus, they shouldn't have any problem paying for a good private police force, right? Their HOA is probably flush with cash, and they can get away. Their HOA can get away with charging a bit more in like HOA fees because the people in that community make more money. But what about poor, rural communities? What about poor urban communities? Is the expectation that they would have to pay more, or that they would have to cover the cost of the policing themselves? Does it mean that they have to pay more in rent? I mean, think about New York City. Think about like really, really, hard hit areas of New York City where rent is already fucking egregiously high and people can barely make rent. And now we're going to add on top of that a private police force.
Well, I think that in a free market society, I mean, first, libertarians would argue that that rent would be more affordable due to more housing space and less regulations. But I think what an ANCAP would say in terms of providing services to lower income or businesses that are or who are just making it, whose margins are low, they would say that it would be in the interest for let's just use Macy's as an example, to provide security to the surrounding areas if they knew that that would overall make the place safer. So they would provide the service to it would be in their interest to provide policing services at no cost to surrounding areas. So let's just say project areas, or let's just say small businesses, because they wouldn't want the danger in those areas to go down and extend out to their retail locations. So just because everybody can't provide afford a service, doesn't mean that they still can't get access to it. There could be just one purchasing.
I disagree with that premise, because if we're talking about Macy's as an example, so Macy's in Midtown Manhattan, maybe they'd create a buffer zone, right? And that buffer zone might extend for all of Midtown. But what about the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side? Where's the Macy's in that area that's going to provide the highest quality service for the surrounding areas, right? What's going to end up happening, because that's a cost that Macy's would have to incur. Macy's just isn't going to set up shop in the Upper East Side, because then they're going to have to think about, well, shit, if I go to this impoverished area and I set up shop here, I could potentially get some revenue. But then I also have to offset that revenue by basically providing a high quality police service in the surrounding areas to make sure that it was safe enough for people to come here. Like, you're chipping away at the profits of a corporation whose sole intention is to make profit. They're just not going to set up shop in areas that are impoverished. You're not going to see a mega company do that. They're just not going to do it. It doesn't make financial sense. And therefore, this would propagate again the issue that a poor community would equal a poorer private police quality, which would then again equal, let's say, poorer land value, which, Rothbard points out, land value would be lower if there's more crime, and landowners would want better at that. It creates this, and lower land volume is going to create more, land value would create more, like, poverty. It's just this negative feedback loop that keeps going on and on and on. And it could result in quasi-gentrification where basically building owners are going to price out their poorer tenants, due to the costs associated with higher quality private police. And those people are going to lose their residency because they can't afford this, extravagantly high, police. Even if it's not extravagantly high, even if it's just a little bit, for a lot of people, a little bit is a lot. And they're not going to get the same quality of service. And I kind of want to move on in a little bit because there is this idea that he points out that basically he makes an argument about, how do I put this? I'll just quote it this way. Okay. He says, on the free market, protection would be supplied in proportion and in whatever way the consumers wish to pay for it. A drive for efficiency would be ensured, as it always is on the market, by compulsion to make profits and avoid losses and thereby keep costs low to serve the highest demand for consumers. Any police firm that suffers from gross inefficiency would soon go bankrupt and disappear. But Jesus, I don't even know how to start with this. I think he fails to recognize that there are issues with the free market that are present, especially today, right? And some examples are why is it that, you can only get, let's say, one or two different cable and internet providers in a particular area, right? It's all like political boondoggling, basically. Why is it that, pharma companies can charge us, 100x the price for the same medicines that they sell cheaper in other countries? It's political bullshit. Why is it that mega corporations like Amazon can get away with paying nothing in taxes and afford to be able to undercut all of the local prices and slowly kill off Main Street? Again, it's political bullshit, right? I think it's naive to think that a savvy business person wouldn't capitalize on the privatization of police forces, right? They would do so to monopolize private police forces, right? Make a giant Amazon of private police forces, price gouge, right? Because now they're the monopoly, they can charge whatever the fuck they want, and they would crush small business solutions to the collective disenfranchisement of the American people.
That's not necessarily true that they would they wouldn't be able to. There's always a service that's going to be able to undercut your price. Like, there's always going to be a cheaper solution for these, or a more affordable solution to business owners or anyone who's in need of policing needs. Like, there's always going to be someone who undercuts that is going to provide a better service, and they're going to lose business if someone
always,
keeps prices.
It's not always. We look at Amazon and Walmart are pretty much eviscerating.
But
it's not
like
they eviscerated the retail market, like, objectively, right? And no private small business can compete with Amazon or Walmart, and it's on the extreme basis of cost alone. There's no one who can compete with them, right? This is like a huge issue in this country right now, and to the idea that a mega corporation of private police forces wouldn't spring up, that's naive. Absolutely, that would 100% happen. Some fucking tech startup guy, or some fucking Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank would be the first to jump on a massive, awesomely branded, you know,
If there was a private police force that was good as Amazon does policing as good as Amazon does providing
deliveries.
deliveries, then that seems like it would be a great solution, to be completely honest. Like if there was an Amazon, if there was a business like Amazon that was able to provide affordable security to pretty much everyone, then that sounds like a good thing to me.
Yeah, but the thing is that they wouldn't be, again, I'm talking about human capital here, right? We're not talking about like physical goods. We're talking about human capital. There is a abject limit to how low you can price human services. They wouldn't have the ability to undercut, you know, or rather I should say they they would have a better ability because of the scale of the contracts that they receive to undercut small private institutions, but there is still an absolute limit at which they can undercut things, right? You can only go so low. I guess in one case would be the minimum wage, but like who would want to work for who would want to work as a private, police officer at minimum wage? No, nobody would do that. And
Well,
you,
there is no minimum wage or
of
taxes
course
in
not.
this
But
society.
let's
There's no
let's just, it doesn't matter
so
whether or not that,
there's no
it doesn't matter.
connection between business and state. Like
It doesn't
there's no
matter.
collusion
Yeah,
or
it doesn't matter it doesn't matter whether or not a minimum wage exists in the libertarian utopia. What I'm trying to say is that if we take what minimum wage is today, let's say $15 an hour, in this world versus $15 in the libertarian world is the same equivalence. It's $15 an hour. Things still cost what they cost, right? Nobody's gonna work as a police officer, a private police officer, for $15 an hour. Nobody's gonna do it, right? They're gonna want to work because their jobs are hard and dangerous, right? They're gonna want to be compensated accordingly.
how about summer jobs?
Summer jobs? What is that supposed to mean?
I'm joking. It's like a summer job being a police officer.
Some yeah. I mean,
I'm just saying a joke.
they're
No,
just
but here's the thing. This is the issue that prevents me from becoming like full ANCAP. Like this is kind of like the start. This is like kind of like where I theoretically can't grasp my head around privatizing the police. My first reaction was mainly due to like kind of like the immediate concerns for it was that revenge killing,
mm-hmm.
like revenge killing with like vigilante justice would go up because to give this to the credit, I think some people would find themselves perfectly able to defend themselves. So some people in rural societies would probably say, I have a gun, I have a property, I can manage my own security. I can put my security in my own hands.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people in like a homesteading environment would
Oh yeah, without a doubt, they just take up their own
would
guns.
not require a security service. So I think we're mainly talking about like cities that would need it, in like a suburban area would be able
Yeah,
to probably
without
get
without a
one
doubt, the
in
rural.
their home association. I think the people that we're concerned about are low income, poor people in inner cities
Which happens
and
to be the
small.
majority of the population, right? So this affects the most people in this country. Most people live in an urban center, right? Not in a rural area, right?
Well, I guess theoretically in this society, there are less ghettos because um, people are just doing better because of the free market.
It's a joke, man. All right, this
Uh,
this is the this
this
is the
is
last thing that I want to talk about from this specific article about privatization of the police, because I think it's kind of like I think he takes like this insurance like approach to policing, right? So he writes, one big problem a government police force must always face is this: what laws should they enforce? And then he talks a little bit about where we apply policing, right? And I'd agree with him generally on a lot of those points. But then he goes on to say the absolute dictum pursues them and works against a rational allocation of resources. So he's trying to say, in this case, and I didn't write this down, but he was talking about how there's this myth that application of police services, even in the in the public sector, are universally spread. Right? It's not like one unit of thing. It's not like I need police services and that's it. Police services is a lot of different things. Right? It's traffic enforcement. It's like conflict resolution. It's evidently it's dog sitting. Like it's a bunch of shit. Right? So, what he says, and he concludes on this point. On the free market, what would be enforced is whatever the customers are willing to pay for. So again, I think he's taking an insurance-like approach here, right? You buy a policy, and it covers some things, but not all things, right? And you make an informed decision as to which things you want to be covered for. And that could be one way to reduce the costs of policing, right? I only need you to stand outside my door from, 12 a.m. to 5 a.m., right? And that's it. That's all I need you for. And so maybe that doesn't cost super much, right? Because, not a whole lot of human capital involved. It's 5 hours, right? But here's the thing, though. Life happens, right? Like with insurance, let's say home insurance, if you don't buy flood insurance and there's a flood, you're shit out of luck, right? But what happens if you're not in a flood zone and you never had a reasonable expectation of flooding? You're still shit out of luck because you didn't have flood insurance. So yeah, there could be a number of people who would say, you know what, I don't really need a whole lot of policing. I just need, level Y, level X, let's call it, right? Well, what happens when Y happens? Well, you didn't pay for that. That's not covered, whatever. And the same thing goes.
That's where the personal responsibility element comes in.
Well, so here's the thing. With health insurance, like it's just like health insurance, though, dude.
But
if you need
health insurance would be completely privatized, and it would, you would get the health insurance that you pay for.
I'm talking about private health insurance here. With private health insurance, if you have a particular plan, and suddenly you need an emergency life-saving procedure that's not covered in that plan, you're shit out of luck. Like, you better cough it up. And there's no reasonable expectation, for most people that I might have needed this coverage. So it's either you buy some ridiculously expensive plan for policing that covers all possible issues, right? And has the maximum protection and coverage, and then you're covered, but you're paying a fucking arm and a leg for it. Or you get a bare minimum policing package and you put yourself at risk of not being covered for this or that, instance that might or may not pop up. But the point, though, is that shit always happens. Paying for what you need sounds great on paper until you need something you aren't paying for. Or worse, that you can't afford.
Well, that's where the personal responsibility aspect comes in.
What is the personal responsibility in that?
You need to purchase the best plan, and there would be options presented by security teams or by private police firms that would have different levels of coverage, and you let the market figure it out. Don't go against the market. You let the market figure out X, Y. If you had a police force A, B, C, and they had a deal, they had a package that would cover, pretty much all policing needs. I guess everything from, I'm trying to imagine the policing jurisdiction that a private police, because it's like not police anymore. It's security. Like, you're not, because I think it just becomes protecting the people from violent criminals, like violent criminals.
All right, fair. And check this, because you bring up a good point, and I still can't wrap my head around this. So, let's say you buy a plan, right? And in this example, Rothbard, he points out, he says, let's say Mr. Jones, he owns a very valuable gem, right? But he also owns a private road, right? And two things that he can get from this private police force are, extreme protection for his, expensive gem, and really good protection for his private road. But let's say, in this case, Rothbard says, the private collector says, you know what, I'm just going to pay for the gem and like the gem police security. I'm not really concerned about the road, right? And so in this case, what we're setting up is an example where what happens, and things do happen. Like, I don't think it's unreasonable to think something can't happen, or that it's so left field that it's an edge case. But what happens if something bad happens on that road? Right? Are those private police forces who are only paid to protect the gem, are they going to turn a blind eye to some violent crime? Let's say a rape happens on his private road. And this police force has the capacity to do something about it, but that's not covered.
So the moral question is, if the service isn't paid for, will they not? I mean, I'm hoping that
they would do the right thing, but like I'm not banking on.
There's conditions in the contract that say, we're allowed to act in some type of moral authority if we see anything related to rape, or anything that would be damaging to society as a whole, as something that egregious. So I'm hoping that that kind of wording would be written out in the type of contracts. And if it's jurisdiction, then hopefully different services, police, private services, would be able to cooperate with each other in some capacity, and kind of talk to each other about what like just kind of like how cell phone companies work. Like, if an AT&T phone calls a Verizon phone, like they're able to work out some deal between each other. It's not like they have like they would be able to work it out if there were two competing jurisdictions. And I'm hoping that in the contracts there would include, like, within vision, if you're able to act to prevent an egregious rape or something like that, then you have the moral authority to act and serve and protect, or however.
I mean, yeah, I would hope that the same would be true. But I think, if we look at examples of private insurance here in this country, whether it be private insurance, home insurance, private life insurance, private health care insurance, there are example after example after example of just straight up cold-heartedness on the part of the insurance providers. And what we're talking about with a private police or security force is it's an insurance policy. The way that Rothbard maps this out, in this article, it's private insurance. And we see countless examples of just companies that, like, oh, you have cancer? Sorry, we don't cover that. Oh, you have, there was a flood? Well, you didn't buy the, insurance. So what? You're fucked. Oops. Auto insurance. Oh, you didn't get super liability protection and somebody hit your car. You didn't get that one. Shows you how much I know about car insurance. I haven't had car insurance in years. But you get what I'm saying, It's like, perfect example. I did own a car at one point, and I had insurance, and I thought I was pretty well covered, right? I was paying quite a bit of money for it. And I thought I had taken out the best policy, and someone decided to break my window and try to steal things from my car. And I called the insurance company, and I'm like, hey, what the fuck? Like, can I get my window fixed? And they're like, nope, you didn't buy that insurance. You didn't buy that specific thing that says somebody is going to break your window. And from my perspective, I thought I had purchased the best possible insurance. And I come to find out that I didn't get that.
You see a lot of that going on right now with business interruption claims of small businesses.
Yeah.
Because they are going to their insurance companies and they're saying, hey, just had to shut down business operations for 3 months.
Where's my money?
where's my money?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, sorry,
We don't cover
we don't cover
pandemics.
pandemics. And they're
Yeah.
like, what? I thought it was emergency disaster loans. Like, yeah, but specifically it doesn't say pandemics. And they're like,
Exactly.
what the fuck? But the government can't do anything because they would bankrupt all these insurance companies if they
Right.
did that, because
Right.
we're talking about every single business. So
Right.
they're kind of, so essentially what the government's doing is they're toting the bill for all of this, or letting them die.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Toting.
in that case, if there's a rape happening on Mr. Jones's private road, and he didn't pay for the private road security, that rape is just going to happen. They're not like if they're like if they're an eye shot, like, because then it becomes a liability for them, right? Like, what if, like, again, we're talking about,
Well, who's raping someone on a private road in
I don't
plain sight
fucking
of a
know.
bunch
It
of
doesn't
people?
matter.
Like, what
It doesn't
society
matter.
are we talking about? We're talking about like Mad Max society.
I mean, rapes happen
Road,
in lots of
Road
different
Warrior.
places.
They happen in lots of little different places, but we're talking about like just such an odd division, like of just someone being raped in front of like a bunch of people who are like walking and commuting to work, and everyone's just like, oh, sucks to be that girl. Like, what?
Dude, I mean, like, it sounds silly and facetious, but like I'm making it extreme on purpose because it doesn't have to go that extreme for there to be like negative repercussion.
That's where we got to bring in citizens arrest. Citizens have the moral obligation to prevent any type of
And not the armed
violent
and not the
action.
armed and well regulated, militia of private polices. No, they're not responsible for that because you didn't pay them for that. It's up to the private citizens to then turn up and save this poor person
Well,
from being
there
raped.
there is a degree of responsibility that has to be taken to live in a society like that upon its citizens, because in this society there are no safety nets by the government, at the very least. There are no subsidies by the government. There are no regulations by the government. Everything is worked out voluntarily between parties in a non-violent way. So, I'll give it to you, man. I'm not someone who's worked out the police, the stateless society in my head. I'm not an ANCAP. I do like a lot of ANCAP stuff, but I haven't gone fully autistic yet. But I'm more of like I'm somewhere between I hate labels, but I'm somewhere between like a old school conservative and like a paleo libertarian. If you were like going to give me a political label, I think that the only thing the government really should be doing are police and courts for the most part. But I think Rothbard does raise interesting solutions about possible ways that you could provide security without relying on cops and making things just better for people who are interacting with the security.
But worse for people who can't afford it.
I mean, at least their idea. I mean, this is like a theory. Like, this is just, these are ideas
Right.
about
And I
how
think
how it could possibly work.
Because it's a theory, I think it's totally fair to
And I think
pick at it.
someone who's way better at expressing libertarian ideas than I am, which would probably be a lot of people listening to this show, would be able. I think a justification would be that that it would be in the interest of these providers to, or not these providers, of these larger corporations to provide security to their communities, because it would create a safer environment for them. I think that would be a big part of the argument. But I'd have to get someone to back me up on this, or at least get someone who's who's thought about this more deeply than I have.
Definitely. Well, I think this is beyond every stretch the longest possible episode we've ever done. So 2 hours and 45 minutes, just about. So I think we should probably wrap this up, and you can agree or disagree, Henry, but I think what I'd like to do is cut this down just a bit, and we'll leave the full version on YouTube. Maybe we promote a little bit there, and then we can cut it down, and if you'd like,
yeah, that's a good idea.
At the end, you can do a little spiel on that.
Let's cut all the ranting in the beginning out, and for those of you who enjoy the ranting, go to the YouTube channel and then listen to the full uncut version, where we just purely give hot takes and opinions on things, and then subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening on iTunes, rate and review the podcast. And we enjoy that. I'm delirious right now because it's like 90. All the AC and fans are off right here, and
yep.
I'm in the south, so it's freaking hot.
I'm in the north, and it's freaking hot.
Yeah, but yeah. I hope you guys enjoy the fact that we whatever. All right, peace, guys. I'm done. I hate closing these things out. Don't do drugs.
Peace.